Welcome to the Holy Spirit's Curriculum of Joy podcast. My name is Wanako Overhuber, and I'm your host. My guest today is David Richards. Welcome to the podcast.
Wanako, thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Start with a question where you can take your time to answer it. How did you come to see the world the way you do today?
Wow, that is a loaded question. Through a lot of adversity, honestly. I grew up in the military. My father was in the Marines, and so we moved around quite a bit. The good news and good part of that was I got to see different parts of the world at a young age. So when I was 10 years old, we moved to Japan. I got to see how the Japanese lived. I got to see how the South Koreans lived. I went to the Philippines. And then I came back to the United States, where it was all America all the time for most of my classmates in school. And so that was a very, very different experience. I joined the Marines after college because I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life or how to make it happen. I had an idea that I wanted to either work in Hollywood or become a famous writer or something like that, but didn't know how to make it happen because in the military, it was very much an insulated culture. And so I joined the Marines. I got to see more of the world. I got to experience what it was like to serve in that capacity. At the same time, there was a tremendous amount of disenchantment because I hadn't liked growing up in the military because of all the displacement and moving all the time and having to make new friends and losing and saying goodbye to friends. And yet now that I was doing that for a living. So after 15 years, I made the decision to get out and I got into corporate America. And probably the biggest thing, which I never thought it would turn out the way it did, but the first weekend I left the Marines, I got into yoga. And I got into yoga because I remember reading an article about football players using yoga to strengthen their core, their midsection. And so I thought, well, if it's good enough for football players, it's got to be good enough for a Marine. So I got into my first or second yoga class. And by the second class, just the idea of being present, I appreciated how it felt to be present. And I realized I hadn't felt present in my life for a very long time. And so I got hooked on yoga. I became a yoga instructor. And then over the course of the next 11 years, I also went back to wanting to fulfill a childhood dream and become a published author. And I initially wanted to write Stephen King stories because I loved horror stories growing up. And between Frankenstein and his work on Carrie or Christine or Pet Sematary, I loved those stories and I wanted to do that. And in Christmas of 2016, I'd been teaching yoga by that point for almost 10 years. And for Christmas, someone got me a whiskey and yoga t-shirt because I liked whiskey and I was a yoga teacher. And I thought that was very ironic, but I loved it. At the same time, I started reading Napoleon Hill's book, Think and Grow Rich, which is a brilliant book. I highly recommend it to people. In the first or second chapter of that book, he asks the reader, what is the purpose of your life? And when I read that question, I was blown away. The idea that my life had direction or an internal compass, a true north that I could navigate to was so profound that I stopped my ambitions of becoming a horror author and said, I'm going to write a book about helping people find their purpose in life. And I wrote Whiskey and Yoga. That was going to be the title of the book. And 10 months later, I wrote it. It was a #1 international bestseller. But along that way, and part of my journey becoming a yoga instructor, I also got into quantum physics. And what's interesting about quantum physics is it teaches you that everything is energy vibrating at frequency. All matter is energy vibrating at frequency. And it's a very stark difference between quantum physics and the world of Newtonian physics, where we physically see everything as separate and it's all materialistic and the basis of reality is material. And when you realize that the basis of reality is energy, then it transforms you. And I started working on my second book in 2019 as I was going through what became the end of a relationship. I got ready to publish the book in 2020. And as the pandemic started, I went through a dramatic and very severe spiritual awakening where I revisited some childhood trauma that had happened to me. And that kind of led me on my journey of faith. And through that journey, I came to see truly came to see what it means to see Christ as the light of the world and see that light universally, not as a condition of being Protestant or being Catholic or being Christian or anything else, but as the universal light of truth, the kind of the Logos made truth. And that had a huge upbringing and influence on me just over the last 5 years. And that also led me to write my third and fourth books.
That's really enlightening. Let's look into that. So you had this insight that this universal Christ light, right? So that you could see everywhere. Would you like to describe that? And I suspect that it was not only, you were just saying it didn't matter which denomination, but does it matter whether someone has a religion or not, or what is, or do you see it everywhere in everyone, and can you go deeper with that?
It's a brilliant question, right? And it wasn't, and I didn't immediately come to that revelation. It was a very slow and sometimes painful and sometimes very scary process. It all began, in April, the first month of the pandemic, in April of 2020, I was working on my book, my third book, and it wasn't going to be religious or spiritual in any way. And I saw this image on Instagram of a woman standing in a field of wheat, wearing a black dress. And within about 30 seconds, I just knew I'd seen the image before somewhere. Somehow this image was tied into something much deeper. And I'd had some miraculous experiences up to that point. And I said, okay, I'm going to write my third book about this picture. This picture has become the inspiration for my book. And it took me 2 years to write the first draft. And that book became Love Letters to the Virgin Mary, The Resurrection of King David. Is this really deep book that meant to tie in kind of to the point that you're making, and that point that I'll address here in a second, that Christ is so much bigger than just a denomination or a religion. In fact, there wasn't Catholicism, there wasn't Protestantism when he taught. And when you extract him out of the religion and the 45,000 denominations of Christianity that are on the planet today, and look at the essence of what his story is, it is about God coming to earth and teaching about love. And that love is really twofold, and it's found in his two commandments. It's the internal love of God, this internal expression of God, which is kind of the vertical axis. And then there's love for your neighbor as yourself, this horizontal expression. And so you put those two things together and it's the cross, right? And I had never thought of it that way. And I hadn't been a practicing Christian. It wasn't to say that I didn't have a sense of morality that was guided by my faith and my upbringing as a Christian. But I had spent so much of my life looking for something else. And then I found it in this picture, which inspired my belief, quite frankly. To your point, the idea that we can only come through Christ through religion, and I've had people kind of espouse that philosophy, right? Well, you have to have this indoctrination into a certain faith. And I feel like that is a mechanism of institutionalized thinking and institutionalized dogma. That is not a condition of a universal Christ's existence. The idea that we have to come through Christ through the indoctrination of dogma. And I'm not saying that you can't have baptism or that taking the sacrament, those aren't worthwhile things. And I'm not disparaging institutional religion at all, or institutional Christianity for that matter. I'm only suggesting that to box in a universal truth and say it's conditioned upon acceptance of the orthodoxy or the institution is misleading, because to me, Christ is so much bigger. And the steps that I took to see that light in everyone, regardless of what they believe, regardless of who they are, it's been bound by those two commandments. Like, okay, if he simplified the 10 commandments into 2 commandments, which he did, and we can talk about what the purpose of the 10 commandments was. And I've read some really brilliant writing by N.T. Wright, who's a British bishop. He's written, I don't know, like 20 or 30 books, but I've read probably 5 or 6 of them in the last few weeks. He really speaks to the power of what Christ did. And when you look at it through that lens and you say, okay, if he is the light of the world, is that a conditional light that I perceive in people based on what they believe? Or is it a universal light based on, I really truly believe that he embodies the logos, the Greek word for the divine order of creation and reason, and that he was the embodiment of that. And naturally enough, as you really get into the meat of what the biblical narrative is about, it is alignment that it's his act of resurrection, which creates the new creation and is the first footstep, so to speak, of God's kingdom coming to earth. And for me, especially working on this book and my last book, which just came out last month, it's certainly an appreciation that to truly grasp the power and the authority of Christ, I feel like you have to take him and extract him outside of the religion and the denominations of how he's perceived.
That's a very important factor because, and another contrast that you were speaking of is that you were in the military, right? And Christ was a pacifist. So, how were you able to reconcile that or forgive yourself for having been in an organization that believes that you need to use force in order to enforce peace?
It's another great question. And what's distinct about military service, certainly in the United States, is you take an oath under God. Like you take an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States, and it ends with "So help me God." So it's a very interesting point. I appreciate what you said about Christ being a pacifist. You look at the biblical narrative, especially in the Old Testament, is certainly filled with conflict and combat. And even I would say the ancient Hebrews' perspective on what they expected from Israel's Messiah, they were looking for a military or political leader who was going to overthrow Rome, not someone who's going to die by this horribly indignant death of being crucified, which was the lowest form of punishment. So in taking that oath, there was a power that comes from taking an oath, and especially when you bind it to God, whatever. And it's obviously, it's not bound to Jesus, it's bound to God. And so if whatever and however you define that, you realize that you are a vehicle, a vessel for that implementation. That's the military perspective. And fortunately, I was in combat, but it was a very mild form of combat. It was really much more about, I was in Somalia in the early 90s, and we were there to help them because there was a famine, because of the drought that was taking place. And there was one warlord who had occupied or who had kind of taken command of the food. And we went in not only to provide relief to the famine, but also to try and create a sense of stability and equality with the different warlords. And that led to the events that precipitated the movie Black Hawk Down. So I don't know that because my actions weren't like, I didn't have to kill anyone, or I didn't get into a point where there's something so psychologically challenging. And it wasn't to say that I didn't have psychological things and traumatic experiences in the military, but it wasn't something that I had to take that forgiveness. And even in the light of understanding Christ's message, is the forgiveness is there. It's the acknowledgement that we're forgiven for whatever missteps we've made throughout our life that I think sometimes is missing. I got out of the military in 2006, and if anything, it was an alteration of my life path, because my father had served 31 years. My brother had served 26 years. I had envisioned myself going that distance. And yet, as I realized how disillusioned I was with my own inner sense of being, because I didn't like moving around, and it was very hard for me to provide stability in my life or create the stable kind of life that I wanted because of those circumstances, I don't feel like I left the Marine Corps and that I had done things that were horrible to my fellow man in the execution of my duties. So in that sense, the act of reconciliation from a military perspective wasn't a tremendous struggle just because I was not asked, or I wasn't put in the situation where I had to take someone else's life.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. But nonetheless, you were in an organization that was willing to ask that of soldiers, right? And to willing to put you into a situation where one used violence and force to get one's way, right? Or get whatever needed to be done. So that's a big thing to shift to the twofold idea of love, right? One to one's source, and the one to one's love thy neighbor as thyself. It's a huge step, and I think that's a very interesting point that you made, that maybe the military is referring to God as we know him in the Old Testament, who was really very sought after as someone who would guarantee your one party to win and the other to lose, right, in a war. So yeah, that is true, that is an aspect in the Old Testament, and, but nonetheless, Yeshua changed the idea about that. He said, no, the father is someone else, right? It's not like that. The parent is different. This is a misinterpretation of what God's role is and how God is, and also the idea that God became accessible, right? He was speaking with God directly, and was also referring to him as someone everyone can speak with. It was not He was not trying to make himself special in that way, even though many do see it that way, right? But so he was seeing himself as a child of God, like, and everyone is a child of God, and so on and so forth. These interpretations of the parent sending his child to save everyone, that's one way of taking it, right? But Yeshua was basically showing a way that we can walk, right? We can walk and talk and live a life in love, right? And respect of each other, and actually a pacifist's way in reality, because no one else would have allowed themselves to be treated the way he was in the end. And then he was able to resurrect, which is another sign of, okay, the pacifist's way is not one in which you are endangering yourself. You actually live forever through the way of love, and you will not lose anything. So in A Course in Miracles, it also speaks about this whole thing. It focuses on the resurrection and the message of the resurrection rather than on the crucifixion, which is a very important point. And also, Yeshua says in A Course in Miracles that it was the last unnecessary journey, so to speak, because he's saying it was just to demonstrate something, but it wasn't necessary, because the truth is the truth, no matter what. So it's a very, very powerful message that you cannot be harmed, and everything where you need to use violence and so on also is proclaiming one can be harmed, and one has to protect oneself from harm. And Yeshua is saying, I'm safe because I am the child of God, and not because I have to do anything in particular to be safe, other than follow his guidance, right? Or her guidance, or whatever one would call it, but God's guidance. And following the will of God is, according to Yeshua, a peaceful will. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think it's a very great point. And at the same time, he talks about rumors of wars, and he talks about he has come to bring variance and pit, a son against the father, a daughter against the mother. And so, and you understand that in some sense, it's because, and certainly to pull this back to the thread that you asked me, how do I come to see the world the way I do today? It's, you realize when he also talks about picking up your cross and following him daily, it's through that alignment. No one comes to the Father except through him. And what else does he say? He's, well, I and my Father are one, but if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so then you realize the access to the Father is really found in becoming one with him. And to do that in some ways, I really like what Dr. Jordan Peterson writes about in his last book, which came out last November, We Who Wrestle with God, which is what the name Israel means. And he talks about the idea that to pick up the cross and follow Jesus really means to assume the messianic path, right? To confront the world's malevolence and to confront your own human frailty and sense of vulnerability and mortality, to foster the deepest level of hope that in doing so, you will ultimately come to realize through an internal sense of conviction that Christ has triumphed over death and sin. And what I've come to appreciate about that is that's, this story comes to me so often because it's so striking to me that this past January, I have dinner with my mother every Sunday, and she's 80, she'll be 84 this year. She lives a few miles away from me. And sometimes I'll just go to her house and she'll cook something, and other times we'll go out and we'll go to a Mellow Mushroom that's close by here. And so neither one of us orders pizza, I have a salad and she has wings. And on this one particular Sunday in January, we went, and she said, "Oh, it was such a good sermon today. It was so good." And I said, "Well, what was it about?" And she said, "Oh, the pastor spoke about what does it mean to give up everything for Jesus?" And it was so good. And then we kind of went on with our meal. And I thought about how many people really take that to heart. Like, what does it mean to lose your life to save it? What does it mean to really pick up your cross and follow it? And I think when you look at people who have had tremendous success in life, whether it's Sylvester Stallone or Oprah Winfrey or Tony Robbins, these are people who have had incredible adversity. Sylvester Stallone had to sell his dog for food while he was working on the script for what became Rocky, the movie Rocky. Oprah Winfrey was sexually assaulted by family members, and built this tremendous media empire. Tony Robbins lived in his car for a while, and now he's a billionaire who owns 110 companies and has impacted millions of lives across the planet. And what you see is there is a thread that's suffering. And that's certainly what Christ tells his followers is, you will suffer for me. Like you will suffer for following me. And there is a component to that. And that's, in some ways, suffering is where we meet Christ in some sense. It's almost like we go down to the pit, and in the pit, we find salvation. And then when you start to realize that salvation is conscious and active and present, not just in when I go to church or not just when I think, but it's always available, it transforms how you look at life, because then you realize, well, if that is in me and I can have access, I can mentally have access to that. If we all share the mind of Christ, which is what it says in 1 Corinthians 2:16, then I have access to that mind all the time. And it goes back to the two commandments. If I have this internal love where I'm connected to source or whatever you want to call it, and then I can recognize that in someone else too, regardless of where they are in their journey, then I am abiding in his two commandments. And as I do that, then that no one comes to the Father except through me, I start to realize that's my pathway towards ascension, is by honoring those two commandments, and by realizing that God sees what's in the heart, not what's on the exterior. You realize when you are authentically doing that and honoring someone's journey, even though their cultural upbringing, their belief system may be different from yours, that again speaks to the transcendence of the universal nature of Christ as the ultimate embodiment of all that is good and unconditional in terms of love.
Yeah, I love that statement that you say it's embodiment of Christ to actually honor each other's path, whatever it is. I think that's really, really beautiful, because there's plenty of people out there who say, I'm Christian, and this other idea of the world or whatever is absolutely evil, right? They might rant about esoteric or about whatever else, right? And they will rant about it and say how bad it is, and you have to get these people to become Christians or to change their mind, right? In that certain way. But to say, okay, actually to live, embody the principles, those two principles that you have found to be so transformative, right? To love the Father completely and love thy neighbor as thyself, or love each other as oneself, right? And I think the other point that we share one mind, the Christ mind, is also a very, very important point, that we all have access to the love, to the joy, and to the clarity that is available through the mind of Christ. And this is a universal mind. It's not a mind, but it is a personal mind. It's one that actually is very, very connected to your everyday life and to everything that's going on, and gives you the answers you need right where you are and not somewhere else. and I think that's a very important thing to be aware of. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and part of what I've been, part of this journey in some ways, it makes me appreciate how I love movies. I've loved movies since I was a kid. I remember I watched the first Star Wars. It was when I lived on Okinawa. It was shortly after Star Wars had come out, and in Japan we only had one American television channel, so I could either watch soap operas after school or I could put a tape in when we had tapes and watch Star Wars with my best friend. And we watched it so many times that we could recite the whole movie. So he would be like Luke and Obi-Wan Kenobi, and I would be Darth Vader and Harrison Ford. And you can make whatever conclusions you can draw that he was choosing the light characters and I was choosing the darker characters. But you appreciate there is a theme to Hollywood films, right? There is a pattern to Hollywood films. And probably the best pattern to draw from is the movie The Matrix that came out in 1999, because it is very much, there is a hero's journey that Keanu Reeves' character as Neo goes through, and it involves resurrection. And resurrection is an inherent component in Hollywood storytelling, whether it's Luke deciding not to kill Darth Vader at the end of Return of the Jedi and save his father, or it's Neo realizing that the Matrix is nothing but information and he can control that information. There is an element of resurrection. And so in that sense, I had never really thought about how Hollywood honors the story of Christ's resurrection through their storytelling and how prevalent that is in all these stories that they tell. And yet you also appreciate that there's a deeper level to that, right? Because it's not just about the internal love to something outside of yourself. It's that if the Spirit, I think Paul says in the letters to the Romans that the Spirit of truth that raised Christ from the dead lives in you. Well, think about that. Think about what that means. If the same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead lives in you, one, that gives a different focus to resurrection. Because, and I think this is one of the things I've discovered in listening to N.T. Wright's books, is that if you think about the Lord's Prayer, the Bible, and even the Bible ends with God coming to earth. There's not a lot of talk about us going to heaven, even though that's what's dominated in Western culture for the past 200 years. And yet that's not what most people practice. Most people think that they escape this body or escape this planet and go to heaven. And the idea is, well, no, God comes to earth. That's how the story ends. And in that sense, when you see that Christ is the firstborn of the new creation, and it's through Christ's example that's what he means when you pick up your cross and follow me, because that transformation, that resurrection, Paul says we all have access to that resurrection power, and it starts to reshape and reorient your thinking, because then you start to see what is the true measure of faith. Because the true measure of faith then is that the idea that Christ has conquered death, has established the everlasting kingdom promised to King David in the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7, takes on a new significance. Because then what it says is, well, if I believe, I grew up with the idea that I would die and then my soul separates from my body and I would get to heaven and I would stand in front of the throne of God. And if I had lived a good enough life, I get the backstage pass to the pearly gates. And if not, you go to the other place. And that was, I remember that was a little pamphlet, like almost a cartoon book that I remember reading when I was probably 5 or 6 years old. And then to read and say, well, that's not really what the Bible says. The Bible says, in fact, Jesus says in John 14:23, those who love me will obey my teachings. Well, what are arguably the two most important teachings are the 2 commandments, because those commandments are meant to supplant and replace the 10 commandments. It's love the Lord your God, which is what the first 4 commandments are about in the Old Testament, and then love others as you love yourself. That's what the last 6 Old commandments are about. And so in John 14:23, those who love me will obey my teachings. My Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them. So that is an internal dwelling, the indwelling of the Spirit. And then when you start to realize that, you start to say, okay, well, if resurrection is arguably the heart, the core of the Bible narrative, which I would contend it is, because there's certainly a significance to Jesus dying for our sins. The act of him raised from the dead, or raising himself, since he says, I have the authority to take my life up and lay it down, is the culminating point. Because if he dies and doesn't raise from the dead, then he's just a martyr. But the fact that he raises himself and then all authority is given to him on heaven and earth, that's the transformation. And then it's becoming the idea, well, then the ascent to heaven, if heaven is supposed to come and earth are supposed to come together and God is supposed to come to earth, then the idea of ascension, Jacob's ladder, it's a conscious activity. It's not, I'm suddenly going to die and wake up and stand in front of this being that I can't barely contemplate that they have saved me. And if my life isn't good enough, then I'm not going to make it into heaven. I mean, there's just a disparity and a disjointedness into, I think, what people believe, even though they say things like the Lord's Prayer, which talks about God's kingdom coming to earth, or they say the Nicene or Apostolic Creed, where they believe in the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting. When you start to really think about how it's one thing to intellectually understand those things, it's another thing to emotionally understand them. It's another thing still to start to say, okay, well, how do I bring that level of certainty and conviction into my body? How do I change my nervous system to live from that place of conviction? And to the point that we've been discussing, the fact that that consciousness, that Christ consciousness, which isn't something that you hear often of in church, but in more esoteric circles or people like Wayne Dyer, you do hear the Christ consciousness. But if that consciousness is always available, then understanding quantum physics, how do I bring that consciousness to life within me so it's always there? So that from my heart, I am honoring God, I'm honoring Christ, I'm honoring the divinity in someone else, because if the spirit of truth is in me, it's in them. That is not a condition of orthodoxy. That is a universal entitlement for our birthright of being human.
Yeah, I think we're going to really deep core issues here. And the also, you were speaking of the embodiment of these principles, right? Of these ideas is so important. And it's always, this passage where it says, no one comes to the Father other than through me, right? It becomes a different meaning, because through me means through this way of being, this way of thinking, this way of perceiving, of understanding, and this personal experience, and rather than this personified idea that it has to be exactly through this historic person that was Jesus, right? But through his teaching, and through the way, through the spirit that dwells in all of us, right? And the Holy Spirit, right? We can actually resurrect as well. And the resurrection was not just for him, but it says we all, the resurrection belongs to everyone. And also the understanding that you can have done nothing that cannot be undone, right? No mistake cannot be corrected, right? Every mistake can be corrected and is corrected already, right? I mean, in A Course in Miracles, he speaks of that as well, right? That you already are sinless and holy, right? There's no, it's not, you don't have to do or say or think to be that. The question is whether you're aware of that, whether you're living through that understanding, meaning that you no longer have these needs to, I don't know, harm in any way, to separate yourself from anyone in any way by demanding you need this from them, or you need that, or you need to achieve this or that, right? You are basically already complete, and to realize that allows you to live totally differently from this, because you have a different understanding of everything that's going on. And it's a journey. I mean, we're all in the middle of it, and we're here to support each other on that, of course, in whatever stage we are at, and for those who are interested in sharing, right?
I love what you said, because it is a journey, right? And it's the hero's journey. And when you realize that you are on your hero's journey, I am on my hero's journey. And when you step back and look at the construct of life that most of us have established, I'll speak for me again, going back to my childhood, and the idea that was impressed upon me at a very early age was die, get to heaven, find out if you've lived a good enough life, and then see what happens. And when you contrast that with the biblical narrative and Christ's example, you're like, well, so basically what then I need to do is I need to take the paradigm, the model of life that I've created for myself, and the belief that I would die first and etch a sketch that, so I can start over and say, that's incorrect. I get to consciously kind of have this transformational fire of the Spirit cleansing me of the things that aren't aligned with Christ's highest truth. And that is a conscious activity. That is a conscious process. At the same time, realizing that there is a reward in doing that. And the reward is an elevated level of consciousness. And I think so oftentimes, at least as my experience as a yoga teacher, and at least being exposed to more esoteric practices, you hear of elevated consciousness in those areas. You don't necessarily hear it in Christian circles as much, and yet you should. And it's partly, I believe, because there is a propensity in Christianity, the way it's been taught, to externalize God. God is out there, God is in heaven, God is far away on his throne. And when you start to embody the teaching and embody the practice, that's when transformation happens, because then it's the realization that, well, Yahweh talks about I am. He tells Moses, tell them I am has sent me to you. And then Jesus says, well, before Abraham was, I am. And so there's a synergy between the Old Testament and the New Testament in terms of the use of I am. But more personally, you start to realize I am is at the cornerstone of our identity. And if we aren't conscious to how we say those words, we can trap ourselves. I can say, I am not good enough, or I am not loved, or I am unworthy. And even if that's whether it's a vocalized thought or a sub-vocalized thought, the fact that comes out, you start to believe that about yourself, and you tell yourself that enough times, and it goes from the conscious mind to the subconscious mind. What I've also come to appreciate is, I mean, the biblical narrative is so powerful, and yet it's you deepen the understanding of its power when, for example, like I've listened to a few of Dr. Jordan Peterson's books. I've seen him speak live twice. I've seen him on podcasts, and he's a psychologist by trade. He was a professor at University of Toronto, I believe, for years, and he invokes Carl Jung the depth work that Carl Jung did and how you have to integrate your shadow or how you have to integrate your anima. The anima is the pathway to the soul. The anima is the feminine aspect in a man, and in a woman, it's called the animus. But it's a psychological reality. And when you start to realize that that is the pathway towards accessing the subconscious mind, that is in effect realizing, like Neo, you take the red pill instead of the blue pill and you follow Morpheus down into the rabbit hole. And as you do that, then you start to awaken to the existence of Christ isn't bound by religion. You don't just find Christ in church. You find him in movies. You find him in people you talk to every single day. And when you understand and make it a universal truth and embody that truth through the practice and authenticity and refinement of honoring his two commandments, you start to see the miraculous. You start to see the beauty, the real beauty of life. And more importantly, I would contend, you begin to see, despite the war in Ukraine, despite what's going on with Israel and Iran or Israel and Gaza, you start to see his authority in the world. And you start to realize that's what it means to overcome the world, is that you don't get caught up in the news cycle. You don't get caught up in people vying for attention on social media or trying to get likes or followers. You start to say, whatever the idea of resurrection is, however that's realized, that is an internal journey. That is an internal recalibration of my physiology, my nervous system, so that I am consciously transforming through the power of faith and through the power of my belief system. And I am internalizing it in a way that then makes me see with confidence that I can walk through the valley of the shadow, or I can take on the adversaries, because I realize that ignorance, evil is born to a certain extent of ignorance. And that's not to say that there aren't malicious people in the world. What it really means is those people have let their shadow overtake them. Their shadow is in the driver's seat, and the good part of them is in the backseat somewhere. And starting to see that path through the world, then you realize, yes, I want to contribute and make the world a better place. I'm not going to do that by projecting ugliness or evil onto other people and saying, oh, it's them, it's those people. I'm realizing that if I am shining the brightest light from within me through the alignment of Christ's commandments, then I'm going to be walking a path that will inspire others with how I speak and how I act, because I will be doing so from a place of congruency where I'm reflecting his love.
Yeah, let's go back to the idea of the last judgment. That was also a significant thing to talk about. And in my understanding, the last judgment, what's so significant about it is it can be in any moment, of course. Like you said, it's not about afterlife or whatever. But it's the significance to me is that you're shown the truth, what actually is going on, the way you've acted, what it meant, and all these things. And by the virtue of being shown the truth, you are shown that you're God, that you're whole, and that you are with your creator, and you're no longer alone, right? In your ideas. So you no longer think you're alone. Let's put it that. You never were, but you will recognize that. And so it doesn't matter what you've done or are doing or have done. What matters is that you're shown the reality, the truth, and that is what resurrects you. That's what brings you back to who you are, and to the remembrance. And it also, if you continue living, let's say it happens during life, during your body still being alive, you will actually live from a very different view of things, because you understand what you understand yourself and your place in creation, in the who you are, in a very new, actually a very, not, it's not new, it's happened, but you will be certain about it, and you will be able to act from that certainty. And that certainty allows you to be loving. It gives you the power to be loving and no longer need to protect yourself with any form of violence or accusations or whatever else might come to mind. You no longer need that, and you are safe as you are. And that's a really powerful place to come to. And I think that's what is so significant about the story in the Bible of how Jesus Christ found his resurrection, right? He resurrected. That's so significant, and that we also have that spirit in us is also very, very significant. So yeah, and in the Course in Miracles, it likes to say you can listen to the Holy Spirit or to ego. Ego is the idea of separation, and the Holy Spirit is the recognition, yeah, our source of who we are, right? Where we come from. It's the right mind, as A Course in Miracles says.
Yeah, I love what you said in terms of the judgment, because you think about it, and I'll share this without going too far into it, but it was March 31st, 2020, and I had just about 10 days before I'd come back from a mastermind in Santa Barbara with Jack Canfield. And Jack, of course, has tremendous success as a speaker and author. He's sold over 500 million copies of his Chicken Soup for the Soul series of books. And it was fascinating because the pandemic had already shut down the world. I was supposed to be one of 17 people for this mastermind, but only 6 people showed up. And I came back, and at the same time, I'd really gotten into Dr. Joe Dispenza. And Dr. Joe Dispenza does really remarkable work with quantum physics and meditation. And through his work, he's had people heal themselves of cancer, heal themselves of Parkinson's disease. And they've been able to scientifically demonstrate that the meditation practice that he teaches people has downregulated cancer-causing proteins and upregulated healthy proteins. And so a lot of his meditations are very dynamic. There's a lot of intense breathing, because what he's doing is teaching you how to project the spinal fluid up your spinal column into your third eye, your pineal gland. And I hadn't appreciated this until I went to Rome last summer, that the pineal gland is a pine cone shaped. That's where it comes from. Pineal gland is pine cone shaped. And so when I was in Rome last August, I went to the Vatican. And in the Vatican, the first place you go to if you go on the tour is in a courtyard. Well, in the opening of the courtyard, they have this giant pine cone. And then you see the Pope with his staff, and he's got the crucifix on it. And at the foot of the crucifix, there's a little pine cone. And I never knew that the pine cone was, as you know, Jesus talks about, if the lamp of your eye is healthy, then you see the world very clearly. And so I did one of these meditations on March 31st of 2020. It was a Tuesday night. And it was really intense, because the whole idea is that you put your conscious awareness into the quantum field, and the quantum field is where all possibilities exist. And I remember the feeling that my consciousness had kind of left my body. And then it was just like I experienced my judgment day. And what I came to appreciate was that is when we touch the consciousness of Christ, and we realize that Christ's love is perfect. His love is unconditionally perfect. And it's through the reflection of that experience that we judge ourselves, basically. Because when we see, and the whole meditation, I wasn't actively participating. It was just this download that all the themes of why my life had turned out the way it had. And it was all about love, because so much of my life had been dominated by love and relationships. And I saw how it was, it had all come up short. And I finished that meditation. And then a few days later, I saw this image of the woman that led me to write my next book. And when you realize that to come to the place of Christ's actual existence, you know, if you go on YouTube these days, there's so many videos that I've seen recently where it's, you know, Richard Hawkins or Sam Harris or Christopher Hitchens or some atheist, and they're sitting with, you know, it could be Jordan Peterson, it could be John Lennox, it could be Wes Huff, anybody, but there's a debate on did he or didn't he exist? Is there a God? Is there not a God? And I get that from a scientific standpoint, the idea that you can discern God's presence, which is a mental, to some extent, and invisible. The kingdom of God is not some place, Jesus says, where you can find it. Oh, there it is, or it's over there, because it's inside of you. I can see why there's skepticism, because you're looking for empirical evidence of something that you must go internal to find. And when I had that experience of what I kind of wrote about it as my judgment day during that meditation, I came out of it and I was just kind of spellbound and struck by, like, okay, I'm just leaving a relationship. I'm 3 or 4 months out of a relationship. There's a global pandemic. I had this really weird encounter when I went to Jack Canfield's mastermind. And now I've just had what I'm fairly confident was my judgment day, because that's just how it came to me. And then to come around to the actuality of Christ's existence. And you get to a place where it is both stunning because of the implications of something that happened 2,000 years ago, and then to realize that that consciousness is present today in the world is staggering to comprehend in some ways. And that was, I struggled very much for the rest of 2020, 2021, into 2022, dealing with that reality, like trying to make sense of, my gosh, this is really real. And yet when you get to that place where you have that internal sense of certainty, the resurrection is a very discrete event, in that pagans at the time did not believe resurrection was possible. They believed there might be some sort of spiritual afterlife where your spirit separates from the body. They did not believe that there was a physically restored, incorruptible body that you now occupied, like Jesus did when he came out of the tomb. And when you get to a place where you realize that's what resurrection is, that's the distinction of Christianity among the pantheon of religions that have gone throughout history, is the perpetuation of eternal consciousness in the human form. I mean, that also is stunning to comprehend. And yet I would say that is the journey of the cross, right? That is picking up your cross and following him with the conviction that he's telling you to follow him because he's already carved the path that we are meant to follow.
Yeah, I think I don't know if you can say it's the thing of Christianity, because if you read the autobiography of a yogi, you hear of these also resurrected, right? These saints. So it's not just, so in the ideas, it's not something that is only in Christianity. It exists in other traditions as well. The idea of the resurrection and the eternal, the ability to be eternally existing with a body or without whatever one chooses to be, or even to the ability to show up as a body, even though the life that body's image comes from is long ago in the idea of history, right? It it's it does exist otherwise as well. So one can't say it's a standing out point of Christianity, but it is a central point in the Christian faith, if you want to put it that way. And I think and it's something that is yeah, important to look at, even though it sounds different than anything else in the world. It's different. It's not what you would expect when you grow up with seeing people die, your pets die, your plants die, and then there's babies born and all these things. All of that is giving you the idea that yeah, things pass, things come and go, and yeah, you and it gives you also the impression that there's so little you can do, right? And if you then have this message, oh, there's the resurrection, you are actually eternal, there is, and all this coming and going, you are capable of changing your mind about it and seeing things differently and having a completely different experience. This is incredible, right? And then you have all these different people or these ideas, right? And having tremendous success with it. Like you said, Joey Dispenza with his meditations has actually had machines hooked up to show or tests done to show that something happened that otherwise you can't explain in terms of purely physical phenomena, right? On the other hand, who knows what is actual physically possible or not? These things, if you see the story of Jesus Christ and the story of Yogananda and all these other masters that are described, right? You're like, oh wow, if that's true, then all these ideas of what is possible and is not possible don't make sense anymore. And you have to find a whole new way of describing your experience and understanding that, yeah, wherever you're at may not be there where you can be, right? But there's so much more that is possible for you.
Absolutely. And that's the beautiful piece too, is because then you say, well, what is a resurrected body? And I may have read something about in yogic circles about resurrection. I think I've always associated it more with reincarnation. So if I misspoke in that sense, I would say certainly from a historical standpoint, Jesus's resurrection is the one that is probably most heavily documented compared to anything else that has ever been reported on. And so then it takes me back to, well, what is a resurrected body? And to me, that's where the beauty of science starts to come in, because if you look at DNA, our DNA is actually like computer code. There are 4 different digits they look at, and that sequence of digits creates the genome. And then you look at, I saw a video a couple weeks back where Neil deGrasse Tyson was talking with a panel, and there was someone on the panel by the name of Dr. James Gates. And Dr. Gates went on to say that he had been studying the mathematical equations around superstring theory and this idea of supersymmetry. And I won't get too far into either one. Superstring theory, basically, there's the idea that there are multiple universes. And in the mathematical equations, he found error correcting code, like we produced in the 1950s. So the binary ones and zeros, he found error correcting code in these equations. And so Neil deGrasse Tyson stops him and he says, so wait, are you saying that at the basis of nature, the reality of nature, you found computer code? And he said, in the math we use to explain nature, yes, we found computer code. And so Tyson says, well, does that mean we're living in the Matrix? And I think he was only half kidding. And Dr. Gates said, it's not the Matrix, it's something more beautiful. And so then you look at this idea that, well, if the idea of a resurrected body is an incorruptible body, so something that doesn't age, doesn't decay, but also is incapable of sin, then you think, well, okay, well, that obviously suggests a higher level of intelligence. It also suggests a higher level of love. And then on top of that, then you start to understand, like when Jesus talks about the idea of unity, he talks about, Father, you are in me, I'm in you, they are in me. And you start to see this idea of inness. And that doesn't often get a lot of airtime, at least in the churches I've gone to, this idea of inness. And you say, well, if the idea is in, that is that's at first a mental game, right? And then it's how do you change your physiology and your nervous system? And that opens up a different path to discussion about how do you physically bring Christ to life within you, or the spirit of truth within you, how do you bring that to life within you? And that can take you down a path of incantations or affirmations and things like that.
And the idea of an error correcting code is also nice. Yeah, but anyways, the true in A Course in Miracles, it also speaks all. There is no such thing as sin, but there are mistakes, and they are all correctable just by changing your mind about things. Right? You just have to allow the Holy Spirit to show you the correct interpretation, and it's corrected. Back into time and into the future. It doesn't matter in which direction you look in the moment. It's corrected completely and forever. And so that's a very beautiful thought. And I think we can start wrapping up at this point. Now that we've shown a really, really beautiful perspective on what it means to be human. So I would like to thank you so much for being here. And if you have anything you would like to add that I haven't asked you or the like, you're welcome to do so before we completely wrap up.
I just want to say thank you so much for having me on. I thought this was really in depth. We covered a lot of ground and a lot of different aspects of faith and belief and conviction. So thank you so much for having me on.
You're very welcome, and thank you for being so candid and so open and willing to talk about these topics, because they can be very confounding, and not everyone finds so many words and so clear sentences to describe it in. So thank you for that. That was wonderful, and thank you everyone for being here. People know about this podcast and about this particular episode, of course, as well. And subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to be a guest, please reach out to me, and we can set up a time for that. And if anyone has suggestions or people they would like to make aware of that they could be a guest here, then please feel free to do so. Blessings to you all, until next time.